Dr. Roy Jackson, and I'll be asking some questions today to my colleague, Dr. David Webster, here at the University of Gloucestershire. The questions I have in front of me are from a Ms. Madden at Finham Park School.
Yeah.
Quite a few questions, but I would try and condense some of them.
I think your year 13 sat around and thought of as many difficult and pleasant questions as they could, and did quite a good job of that, I think.
So some may overlap, etc., but we'll cover what we can in the time we have. There is a recurring theme here, though, I think, and that is on the issue of the soul. And I think probably the best first question here is really to ask about what do we mean by the soul in terms of, is it eternal, is it unchanging, can it be reincarnated, etc., those kind of questions.
I think those questions, often there's a presupposition in them that we're talking about the Christian idea of the soul, because if we're not, then it's all open for grabs and can be any version of the soul. But if we're limiting it within Christianity, and I think a lot of people talk about the soul in that context, or in a vaguely Christian context, even without saying that, the interesting thing to note is how much theological reflection on the soul has not made it, like we sometimes think of it, as a separate thing from mind-body, as an entirely separate, eternal, unchanging unit within oneself, a bit like you might say the Atman kind of is in Hinduism. In Christianity, the soul is not so much like that, although we tend popularly to think of it in that way. Often there's much more of an association between the soul and the mind in Christian thought. The body and mind, it might be dualistic, but it's not triunine in the sense of mind, body and soul. So there's actually quite a strong identification between one's mental life and this idea of the soul. So I think that gives you a sense that much more, that's quite important.
Yes. I see. So it depends what we're talking about here, whether it's a Christian view or even a Muslim view or a Jewish view.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, philosophers themselves differ quite considerably over what the soul is and what they mean by the soul.
It's one of those things where people think they know what they mean, and they talk about the soul in all sorts of contexts and ask questions like these questions about the soul, but often don't stop to reflect and say, well, what do we mean by soul? Is it something that can survive without the existence of a body? In which case we can talk about a disembodied life after death as an option. If a soul can't exist without a body, and the view of the soul is more associated with the mind, seems to imply that perhaps it's makes less sense without a body, would need therefore there to be some form of re-embodied post-mortem survival. I.e. in heaven you'd need a body, you're just going to be a floating soul. If the soul is much more, if the connection between mind, body and body, soul is much more intrinsic and important.
Yes. Yeah, great. So in the sense that links into none of these questions, because again, they will depend upon what kind of religion we're talking about. For example, one question is about whether an animal, when died, will be reborn as an animal again or as a human. But again, that depends upon what religion you're talking about.
So within Christianity, of course, we tend to get the conventional view, at least, is that animals don't have souls. And the process of ensoulment in the creation of humans is what makes us distinctive. And therefore that rather twee stereotype that when you get to heaven, all the animals you've ever owned in your life will come running towards you. Oh God, remember that hamster? It doesn't actually match the theological view, in which animals are much less than human in some sense. And that souls are therefore attached to those other things that make us human, like free will and moral blame, ethical choice and things. And there's a quite strong link. Of course, in non-Christian traditions that do believe in rebirth, like Hinduism and Buddhism, the main ones, that question is a bit complicated, because in Hinduism there is a sense of this thing called the Atman, which is reincarnated, and we will have had both human and animal reincarnations in the past and probably in the future. In Buddhism, it gets a whole heap more complicated, as you know, because of the sense in which there isn't a soul. There isn't an Atman either. There isn't a thing that gets passed on. What happens in Buddhism is much more to do with an unfolding continuity of being and not a thing carrying on. which goes against at least our conventional ways of viewing the soul in the West.
Yes.
Um,
Good. I like this question still related to the soul, so we'll stick with this one a moment more. If me and an ant swapped brains, where would I be?
Well, that's a good question. And in standard Hollywood discourse, we know exactly who you are. You are your brain. You don't have to think of Freaky Friday or any of those brain swap hijinks films.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you swap brains with someone, it means you're in their body. So there's very much a sense, there's a presupposition built into that, which culturally we all seem to accept without thinking, that I am not my body is a chariot in which me, the person, drives along at the controls.
Yes.
And if I was to die, but just before my death, I transferred my consciousness, my mind, into another being, I could then be them. We've seen that in, is it The Witches, where he gets transferred into a mouse or another kind of animal?
Yeah.
I'm vaguely remember I've taken kisses of something. But I could therefore have my brain in an ant and be looking around going, oh look, I'm an ant. And things.
Yeah.
So that's very much how we culturally have viewed things. I'm not sure actually that it makes sense, because you could argue the brain and the body are not separate. They're deeply, and that I wouldn't have this consciousness without this wetware, as people sometimes call it, with this substrate of chemical soup that I'm currently floating about in. If I hadn't got that, I would be a really different person. And that this separation is really false and problematic.
That's right, because it raises issues about personal identity,
Yeah.
really, doesn't it? I mean, if I looked into a mirror and I saw myself as an ant, I would immediately start to change anyway, presumably in the way I respond to myself.
You might be a little surprised.
At least. Sometimes I look in the mirror now and I'm very surprised, to be honest.
That old man comes. That happens. But certainly, and also, an ant's brain can't do what your brain can do.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yes.
So even if this idea, my consciousness is going into even a mouse or something, a mouse's brain, if that's the right way of saying it, can't support the kind of complex processing that a human brain can support. And it does raise, as you say, questions about personal identity and to do with memory. And is it to do with knowing I'm the same person or not? Because a lot of rebirth is based on the idea that we are the same person, but we don't know it. And for a lot of people, that won't wash, because a preconditional identity is memory.
Yes, indeed. And it comes back to the whole idea of the soul, of what aspects of the soul, if it does go on to another life, does it include your personality? Does it include your memory? Does it include something much more abstract, just as reason or something like that?
The more you abstract it, and the more abstract it gets, the less it seems like me. Because there's a sense in which we talk about the soul in both religious and kind of more casual circles being the real me. There's a temporary change in me that's in a good mood one day, a bad mood the other, currently likes this, then like that, and that's various kind of passing features. But then there's the real me, which is something essential about me, some essential meanness of spirit or generosity or whatever, kind of your core characteristics.
Yes.
And people often say the soul is kind of the real you. But that's very emotional, psychological often, the way that you talk about the real me. Very dispositional in terms of kind of attitudes towards things. But a real me that was just reason, I'm not sure what that would be.
Yes,
but in order to make it eternal and not dependent on physical, wet, sloppy brains, or not dependent on kind of a body, the more you go down that route of thinking about the soul, the further you move away from something that I recognise, and therefore the more I move away from memories and those criteria of identity.
Yeah, in which case you wouldn't really look forward to the next life anyway.
You think, I'm going to spend eternity in heaven as this robot,
yes,
or doing reason, or sometimes you hear people talk about heaven as kind of eternal communion with God, and I can understand the kind of devotional sense in which people might say that, but from a more philosophical way of thinking, I don't know what they mean. I'm just completely. It's kind of. I know it's an attempt to articulate something that can't be quite put into words, but I don't know A, whether I like it, and B, what would that be like? What does that mean?
Yes, I'm confused too.
We can't answer that question.
No. Okay, great.
But I think the soul is a problematic notion, and I think before we get into any of those questions, which are good questions that are thrown up by all those issues, we have to actually think, well, what do we actually mean by the soul? How do we even kind of begin to think about what a soul is, and whether it makes sense to talk of it as separate from us, and whether, if we can, that it's our soul, which is a soul at all.
Thank you very much.